Thank you. As we move to Mr. Sarbanes, let me just ask this real quick question. If you had to rate our emergency systems, the care systems, using hospital terms like intensive care, critical condition, the various terms you all use, how would you all describe it?
I would say it's life-threatening. We're resuscitating it on a day-to-day basis, and it's going to die if we don't fix it. And I don't know if that's hospital terms or not, Mr.
Well, it sounds pretty hospital terms to me, but it sounds like almost like funeral home terms, too.
Let me just go on and say I meant what I said before. If it wasn't for the dedication of the nurses, the paramedics, and the physicians that struggle with this on a day-to-day basis, this system would have broken already, and that was the conclusion of the Institute of Medicine's report.
Dr. Johnson?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that you're looking at the proverbial canary in the mine right now. You're looking at them face to face, because I'm here to tell you that when I take my last breath in that emergency department, it will be when that system completely falls apart. And I'm on my last breaths right now. I'm telling you right now. So we are the canaries. The emergency physicians and nurses and personnel are, I've had some of my best nurses leave my department, which is, I believe, one of the best departments in California, to go to other areas of the hospital, like the cath lab, where they can get paid the same salary for half the work.
Mr. O'Connor? Dr. O'Connor, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think without using hospital terms for the patient's condition,
that's why I said hospital, because I wanted a brief answer.
well, this will be very brief. In terms of what's acceptable to the staff, situations that used to be considered bad days, tough days at work, are now routine, and the threshold to which some of the days rise is appalling.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the privilege for almost 20 years to represent as my primary clientele community hospitals in Maryland and the region, probably 25, 30 hospitals over the course of that time. And so this problem is one that I'm very familiar with from all sides, and it's almost impossible to overstate it. And you're trying your best here to do it in ways that will get our attention, which I think you have, but hopefully broader attention. Dr. SCHWAB, you said the patient may die when asked to assess the system using those kinds of terms. And Dr. Johnson, you said that the system, you're holding on before the system completely falls apart. What does that look like? What does the system look like when it dies or completely falls apart? What's the prospect down the road that we can look back later to the testimony in this hearing and say, well, this is not a surprise to anybody. We predicted this would happen. This is sort of the fundamental human problem of if A, then B, if B, then C, but for some reason we can't get it together to have the minimal amount of foresight to step in now and do something. So what does it look like when the system dies? What is that image for you? What's that morning after movie that we're going to see?
Well, let me tell you that what I started with was telling you about my Wednesday afternoon, which is a pretty typical day. What you probably know is that if we are the most frequently closed trauma center in the state of Pennsylvania. We're closed 9 times more than any other trauma center in the state because of volume. So I see this doomsday picture you're asking me to give you. I see it momentarily, because what happens is we close, ambulances are diverted, ambulances go to other centers, some are not trauma centers, there are no surgeons waiting, and ultimately what happens, I think, if we could ever prove it and would dare to prove it, is patients die. If the emergency system falls apart, rather than that being episodic throughout a day, it's going to be continuous, and it'll be some kind of terrible movie that I don't want to ever think about. But it is happening now in our largest cities and even some of our suburban areas. It happens. People are diverted, and there is now excellent study to show that other patients don't do well with diversion. They die while they're being diverted. There's also now studies, one of which coming out of ours at the University of Pennsylvania, to show that if you simultaneously, on an overload condition, ED spill, everybody's busy, you're doing major trauma cases and yet another, let's say, cardiac code comes in, there is data to show that those patients don't do as well. Why? Because everybody's busy. Think of O'Hare International Airport on Friday afternoon, a terrible thunderstorm, and all flights are canceled. What it is like. It is mayhem. And in mayhem, unfortunately...
You've conjured up an image in my mind where the ultimate diversion is straight to the morgue. That you're going from one hospital to one hospital to one hospital. You can't get in. And eventually, you just pass it by and you go straight to the morgue. I mean, that's what I'm hearing here. Dr. Johnson, you wanted to respond.
In your scenario, what would probably happen is that a patient would stay in the ambulance until they reached a point where they would die, and then the ambulance would have the ability to upgrade the patient to a status and go to the nearest facility regardless of what their status would be, whether they're open or closed. So patients eventually do have a finite period of time which they can ride around in the ambulance. I'll tell you what would happen though in your scenario. It would be a very slow incremental collapse of the system, beginning with the loss of subspecialty capability. So neurosurgeons, orthopedic surgeons, hand specialists, they would eventually be gone of most facilities. And probably what would happen is you'd lose them in your rural areas for those that have that specialty backup already, and then you'd lose them from your suburban areas, and what would happen is those specialists would consolidate in fewer and fewer and fewer facilities, leaving more and more facilities without any subspecialty backup, which would mean if you come in with something other than something that would be under the capability that I could handle as an emergency, anything that required plastic surgery, or if you needed a hole drilled into your skull to relieve pressure from bleeding, that would not happen, and you would, of course, then die in my facility, because I would not be able to transfer you anywhere, and I would not have the specialty backup in order to take care of you. So in the scenario of increasing mortality, that's how it would happen. The lack of subspecialty services would mean that patients would die at the institutions they're at. We would, of course, see increasing ambulance diversion to the point where you'd have some facilities that would be on ambulance diversion continually. I know that in my area, there was this rule in Los Angeles area that if you're on diversion for so many hours, you then have to go off diversion for an hour before you can go back on. So it would gradually be a diversion, off diversion, diversion, off diversion.
Well, you're
kind of game.
describing an emergency diversion system, not an emergency care system. And I thank you all for being as candid about this as you're being. Let's talk about the solution. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.